Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final installment of the International Microhistory Seminar for this season, for the fall. And today we're extremely lucky to have with us Ryan Thomas and Ollie Bush, who are going to present the paper on monetary and fiscal policy during the Great Inflation period in England in the 60s and 70s. This is, although we chose this topic almost 6 months ago, it seems very topical now with what's going on in England right now and in the world in general in terms of inflation. So please, without further ado, let's welcome the speaker. Hi, Ryland.
Hi, Nathan. Good to go? Yeah, I'm good to go. Let me share my screen quickly. Hopefully you can all see it. Hopefully you can see that, everybody.
Yes, we can see that.
Great. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. So thank you to Nathan for the kind introduction, and to Rui and the seminar organisers for giving us the opportunity to present our paper. As you can see, this is joint work with Mike Bordo at Rutgers and Ollie Bush, who is a colleague of mine at the Bank of England. Mike sends his apologies, he can't make it today, but Ollie's able to join us as well. Now, the paper is very much in a formative stage, as you might have seen from its length, for those of you who've seen it, so your comments and suggestions would be very welcome. The usual disclaimer applies to Ollie and myself that these are our personal views and not those of the Bank of England or its policy committees. Now, I guess, as Nathan suggested, given recent events in the UK, I don't need to motivate the paper too much. Recent UK experience has shown the importance placed by financial markets on perceived fiscal sustainability during a period of elevated inflation. But the motivation for looking into this period is a bit more general than that. In fact, we began to work on this before the pandemic. And the idea was to look at why the UK experience in the Great Inflation was different to the US and some of the other G7 countries, with perhaps the exception of Italy. Now, most of the US and indeed UK literature emphasizes monetary policy failures over this period, but our conjecture was that the UK inflation experience may have had fiscal as well as monetary policy roots, and so is an example of what you might call British monetary and fiscal exceptionalism. But we're also motivated by the question of what ends periods of high but moderate inflation, and whether the UK experience fits with Tom Sargent's argument from the early 1980s that the end of an inflationary period normally involves some form of fiscal consolidation. So how do old and new fiscal theories of inflation square with the UK experience in the Great Inflation and afterwards? And do we see evidence that the inflation expectations depend on the combined monetary and fiscal regime? So to set the scene, let's start with a chart of UK inflation over the Great Inflation period, which we define roughly as the period from the devaluation of sterling in 1967 all the way up to the adoption of inflation targeting in 1992. Though some people argue inflation had been brought down effectively by the mid-1980s. Now, if we look at the pattern relative to the rest of the G7, and here I've excluded Italy from the red line in this chart. You can see how different it was. The peaks were more pronounced, and UK inflation reached almost 25% in 1975, which was much higher than that in the rest of the G7, with a second peak in 1977 and a more prominent peak in 1980. Now, the one exception to the comparison is that with Italy, which is more similar, and that might suggest some common fiscal roots for high inflation in this period, given the work of Fratiani and Spinelli and others, who've emphasized the important role of fiscal policy in explaining Italian inflation over this period. Now, if you look more closely at the pattern of UK inflation, it looks like what we call a sort of roller coaster pattern. There are sort of four prominent peaks of double-digit inflation during the 1970s and 80s. Inflation sort of picks up very quickly in each, but then falls back quickly. So it's sort of a succession of temporary bursts, if you like, hence the roller coaster analogy. But underlying that, obviously, there is an underlying pickup in inflation from the late 1960s, and which only comes back down by the mid-1980s, which I'll come on to a bit more detail later. Now, it's interesting to compare the measure of inflation with a measure of inflation expectations. And on the chart here in the green line, we have some data on one-year ahead household inflation expectations, and these do show a drift up in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but show less of the roller coaster pattern thereafter. Now, they do appear to sort of lead inflation, the expectations, but they don't appear to respond to these bursts of inflation, particularly the high inflation here in the mid 1970s. Expectations then sort of shift down a little bit in the late 70s and then again in the early 1980s. So inflation expectations, at least on this measure, appear less adaptive than perhaps conventionally thought, and suggest perhaps inflation might be driven more by regime shifts and heuristics rather than some simple adaptive mechanism. Now, our argument is, or our conjecture is at least, that shifts in the fiscal regime may be contributing to inflation expectations at key points. Now, of course, when you look at the public sector position leading up to the Great Inflation period, it's not abundantly clear that the UK had a much of a fiscal debt problem, at least in the sense of looking at stocks of debt. If we look at the blue shaded area here, this is at the end of the 1960s, the debt income ratio was well below 100% of GDP and falling. And strong post-World War II economic growth implied that real rates were generally lower than the growth rate. So it's not clear that the UK was imminently coming up against some sort of debt limit that might have raised imminent expectations of future inflation or monetization. So as I put it here, there's not really an obvious Sargent and Wallace unpleasant monetarist arithmetic story that would sort of appeal to this type of argument. However, we look at the flow of borrowing, and in particular the primary fiscal deficit, which is important for assessing fiscal sustainability. There does appear to be a fundamental shift in the mid-70s in what you might call British monetary fiscal orthodoxy. Now, a standard tenet of that orthodoxy, stretching back to the origins of the national debt in the late 17th century, was that the government should typically run a primary surplus in peacetime, which would then allow it to borrow heavily in wartime and other crisis periods. However, in 1974-1975, the government ran a peacetime primary deficit for the first time in 300 years. And indeed, the overly pessimistic fiscal forecasts of the time suggest it was only going to get worse. And essentially, what financial markets soon conned on to this. And in 1976, there was both a gilt strike where institutional investors refused to buy government debt, even at very high yields. And there was also a sterling crisis leading to a large depreciation of sterling, which necessitated calling in the IMF in 1976. So perceived fiscal sustainability by financial markets appears to have been at least some cause and possibly the root of the problem in the mid-1970s, much like recent events. But there's an underlying question of how this relates to both older and new fiscal theories of inflation, which I'll come to a bit later. Now, a more underlying theme of the paper is the characterization of how the monetary fiscal regime developed after the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971. Was it more a case of muddling through or tunneling through, as we call it? Now, given time constraints, I won't try and develop this argument too much in the seminar today, but it's perhaps one thing we discuss more in the paper and perhaps a topic for discussion after the seminar. The plan for the rest of the seminar is actually to show you some evidence from the narrative history section of our paper, which shows how the UK evidence during the Great Inflation accords with the sort of bad luck versus bad policy lens through which the US and other countries are often viewed, or the experience in other US and other countries is often viewed. And there are obviously some common threads here that need to be teased out, but also some indications of the importance of fiscal policy. What we'll then do is show you some results from a range of empirical models to gauge the plausibility of our conjecture about the link between fiscal policy and inflation expectations, which may be particular to the UK. And as you'll see, we'll focus on the mid-70s period for much of this analysis, where we have some tentative evidence of what we call local fiscal dominance, but I'll come on to that a bit later. Now, some of the key hypotheses in the current literature on the Great Inflation in the UK are similar to the US story. They involve a sort of narrative combining bad policy and bad luck, with the respective weights on each a bit in the eye of the beholder, or a bit in terms of the analysis applied. Now, I've listed some of the key hypotheses here, and I'll cherry pick some evidence from the paper on these in turn. So if we start with the bad policy, now a lot of the bad policy literature on the UK argues that the policy mistakes in the 1970s were a legacy of what happened in the 1950s and 60s. After World War II, there was this post-war consensus on maintaining full employment, given the experience of the Great Depression, and that was based on fiscal stabilization as a fiscal stabilization policy as a tool and means of achieving that. But that then led to what was called the go-stop cycle, where fiscal policy would end up overheating the economy and then slamming on the brakes in quick succession. Now, this then developed into a more dynamic theory of how fiscal policy might be used to achieve faster growth, and this was sort of motivated as the UK was appearing to perform worse than other countries in the post-World War II period. And this link between demand pressure and growth was partly based on empirical and partly based on theoretical evidence. There was something called the Dunes Law, which was associated also with Nicholas Caldor, who's an advisor to the UK government in the 1960s, where it was argued faster growth in manufacturing, increased productivity through economies of scale. And so if you could press the accelerator on demand and get growth in manufacturing, you might get lower inflation rather than higher inflation. There was also Roy Harrod's theory of growth, which also suggested running the economy hot to try and achieve a high investment ratio and achieve better productivity growth through that mechanism. So there was this misguided belief, or what turned out to be a misguided belief, that running the economy hot through fiscal policy and demand stimulus might also achieve faster growth. Now, before 1971, this was less of a problem for inflation. The Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate constraint would mean most of the go phases attempting to boost growth would quickly lead to a balance of payments deficit and then induce a stop phase where policy was tightened to maintain the peg and inflation wouldn't get out of control. After 1971, obviously, the Bretton Woods constraint was no longer there, and future attempts to boost growth would largely lead to depreciation and inflation when attempted. Now, this chart shows you some narrative evidence that the go-stop policies of the 1950s and 1960s carried on into the 1970s. According to the narrative work of James Cloyne in a 2013 paper, there is a demand management-related fiscal expansion in 1972, the Barber boom, and also possibly in 1978, both of which preceded two of the peaks in inflation that I showed you. Now, the most famous of those two episodes are the Barber boom, and is one which people have recently drawn the most parallels with the recent UK experience, was an attempt by the Chancellor at the time, Anthony Barber, to target, using fiscal policy, a 5% annual growth rate to be met over 2 years, primarily met through reducing income taxes. Now, there's a bit more detail on the exact nature of the Barber boom and how it panned out. But obviously, I've just shown you here the quote from Barber himself at the time, who said, "I do not believe that the stimulus to demand I propose will be inimical to the fight against inflation." Unfortunately, things didn't turn out that way. Now, of course, fiscal policy may not have been a problem had monetary policy been active in a modern sense and reacting it in the ways we would argue, or optimal policy would argue it should work today. But it is evident at the time, at least in the early to mid 70s, that monetary policy was not reacting to fiscal or indeed other shocks in the 1970s in the way we would expect an inflation targeting central bank to operate today, given the Taylor principle and other optimal policy prescriptions. Now, the Bank of England was not independent at the time, and the government was in charge of setting rates. And at the time, it was very reluctant to see interest rates rise, given things like the growth in home ownership, and obviously the ambitions for growth that I mentioned a moment ago. Now, if we look on the left-hand side here, this is a measure of ex-ante real rates based on the household inflation expectations that I showed you. And as you can see, real rates went negative over this period, highly negative during the 1970s. And as a result, interest rates were well below what those would be prescribed by a simple Taylor rule, which I've shown on the right-hand side here. And this is a measure based on real-time data, based on work by Nelson and Nikolov. Now, augmenting that bad monetary and fiscal hypothesis further was the introduction in the early 70s of banking and financial sector reforms and the lack of foresight that was argued in the implications for money and credit growth. So despite growing academic and policy interest in monetarism following Friedman's work in the 1960s, economists such as Ed Nelson have argued that UK policymakers suffered from what he calls the monetary neglect hypothesis, where the implications for money and credit growth were not sufficiently appreciated from reforms to the financial sector. And in particular, the competition and credit control reforms in 1971, which removed a lot of the direct controls on the banking system that had been operating in the 1950s and 60s, led to an explosion of money and credit around the same time as the Barber boom and just after Bretton Woods collapses. And what you can see in the chart here is a pickup in broad money growth to around 20% in 1973. And this sort of leads the 20% plus peak in inflation by around 2 years. And a similar relationship seems to appear in the late 1970s as well. And both of these appear to conform to the Friedmanite prediction of there being long and variable lags between money growth and prices. Now, many monetarists at the time and even monetarists today, point to this as a key piece of evidence linking money growth to inflation. However, as I will show later, this expansion of broad money was not just the counterpart of private sector credit creation and the relaxation of these controls on the banking system. There was a strong fiscal link as well, as I'll come back to. So that's the sort of evidence on bad policy. There are elements of bad fiscal policy, bad monetary policy there that are, and similar stories you might apply to the US. And other countries, but much of the bad luck hypothesis centers around the size and incidence of cost push and adverse supply shocks that affected the UK and other economies over this period. So this is the sort of bad luck cost push view of what happened over this period. Now, what I've shown you here is a chart that shows a breakdown of UK inflation into the weighted contributions of unit wage costs in green and import prices in blue. And there's a residual item here in brick red, and this reflects margins. It's basically a residual which reflects shifts in profit margins, including those arising from the sluggish pass-through of import and wage costs into inflation. And as you can see here, both import prices in blue and wage costs in green picked up markedly ahead of the inflation peaks in the mid and the late 1970s. And then there's passed through to inflation with a lag, as you can see from this switch from negative margins into positive margins later. So this is the sort of a rough description of the cost push view of inflation that happened over this period. Now, a lot of that import price inflation was due to the well-known pickup in oil prices in the mid-1970s, in 1973 and 1979. Oil prices tripled and then doubled in these respective instances. You can see on the left-hand side chart here, the real sterling price of oil. But this was compounded, it is also well known that food and other commodity prices also increased markedly over this period. So this is not just a question of oil prices. Now, this was compounded by the fallout from the collapse of Bretton Woods, which led to the flotation and the depreciation of sterling in 1972. And as a result, you can see here, sterling import prices rose by around 50% in 1974. So we talked a bit earlier about monetary policy responses, but I think a cost push shock of that magnitude would have challenged any government or central bank trying to manage monetary policy trade-offs in that environment. So that's to put that in context, import prices in context. Now, wage costs was similarly an important source of cost pressures, as I showed you earlier. Wage inflation peaked ahead of inflation in the late 1960s, but also in the early 1970s, and most spectacularly in 1974, with wage increases of over 30%, which presaged the peak in inflation of 25%. Now, part of this may have reflected deeper performance issues on the supply side. The post-war golden age in productivity growth appeared to go into reverse in the late 1960s onwards. This is sort of shown in the left-hand side chart here, which is a measure of trend growth from an observed components model. And similarly, if we look at the labour market and we do a sort of Kalman filter model of wage inflation to try and extract the narrow, we also find that the natural rate of unemployment, as estimated by this model, appears to pick up in the 1960s. And as we can see here, unemployment appears to be persistently below that estimate of the natural rate for much of the late 60s and 1970s. So there's some proximate evidence here of declining supply side performance that would be pushing up on wage inflation. Now, obviously, a key factor that was argued to have been behind increased wage pressure and this rise in the narrow was heavily unionized labor markets and the power exerted by overmighty union leaders. Now, in fact, the picture is actually much more nuanced than that. Many of the union leaders recognized the dangers of high inflation and the wage explosion of the early 1970s. Indeed, at the end of the trade union conference of that year, one of the key leaders expressed his view to the others that we just simply can't go on like this. However, it was clear that there were some weaknesses in the UK's bargaining framework. Private sector collective bargaining was decentralized at a local and plant level, and there were often multiple unions within a plant. This meant that the union leaders themselves could not easily control the sort of local shop stewards who would negotiate pay and working practices at the plant level, and multiple unions would compete with each other for higher pay. But overall, it was not clear that the problems of unions in the UK was comparatively worse than that in other G7 countries, in particular if we look at strike activity and other measures. It seems to be more of a problem of resistance to the introduction of new work practices and the impact on productivity that was probably a more direct role in pushing up unit wage costs. Now, indeed, part of the wage volatility that we see over this period may actually have been bad policies in response to perceived union power rather than union power itself. In particular, prices and incomes policies were in place for long periods. And while they worked temporarily, most notably in 1976 and 1977, the grey shaded areas here show you periods of when incomes policies were in operation. In reality, incomes policies were very much like sitting on a powder keg, where pressures and distortions would build up when the incomes policy was in operation, and simply led to a wage explosion once lifted. And famously, in 1973, the incomes policies of the time introduced what were called threshold agreements, which indexed wages to consumer prices at just the wrong time, literally a matter of weeks before the first oil price shock. And this locked in a disastrous amount of real wage rigidity and made a big contribution to the 30% wage inflation in 1974. Furthermore, when we test the link between wages and inflation expectations, we find that inflation expectations, as I sort of intimated earlier, do not appear that responsive to past outturns of wage or price inflation. So it means that the wage price spirals allegedly occurring over this period were probably more limited than conventionally thought, given that inflation expectations appear largely unaffected by past outturns. So taking all this together, there's little hard evidence of what you might call a runaway cost push accelerationist story here, although clearly wage increases over 30% in 1974, 1975 were unsustainable. So there are lots of nuances here to what might be called a conventional story of wage pressures and arising from union power. But perhaps the most important factor, especially with regard to fiscal policy, was the strength of unionization in the public sector and essential services, such as the coal and energy industries. Public sector unions had strong bargaining power, and high wage settlements could destabilize the public finances, which is a link that we're obviously interested in. Now, public sector employment was growing towards a peak of around a third in the mid-1970s, and public sector wage settlements, shown here on the right in red, exceeded those of the private sector by as much as 10 percentage points in the mid-1970s. So although private sector wage settlements were very strong, the extra public sector wage inflation would spill over into the public finances, and so there was an important fiscal channel here that we return to. So that's some narrative evidence on bad luck and bad policy hypotheses and how they might apply to the UK. So how can we try and assess that, assess the relative importance of some of these hypotheses? Well, what we try and do in the paper, and very much as a sort of first pass and broad overview, is a structural VAR analysis, where we try and identify the various shocks to the economy using theoretical restrictions, and then look at how policy reacts to those shocks relative to some historical benchmark. And what we do is we estimate a 10-variable VAR over a long sample period from the 1960s up until almost the present. So this includes the low inflation targeting period of the 1990s and onwards, which allows us to compare the great inflation with later periods of what you might call better or good monetary policy. Now, we use a co-integrated framework to allow us to distinguish between permanent shocks and temporary shocks. And we cover credit and monetary variables as well to account for some of the changes in credit policy that I mentioned earlier, the competition and credit control policy and other changes. Now, 6 of the shocks we identify here are the sort of standard aggregate supply, aggregate demand and monetary policy shocks you see in most VAR, structural VAR analyses. But in our framework, we try and split these into permanent and temporary shocks. So, for example, aggregate supply shocks are split between those which have a permanent effect on output and those which only temporarily push up on prices and down on output. Sorry, I should push up on inflation, I should say, temporarily and down on output. Oil prices and commodity prices could, of course, lead to both a temporary and a permanent effect. So it's not that they will be captured in both of these. Similarly, monetary policy shocks are split into what we call a permanent effect, on those which have a permanent effect on the inflation rate, such as an explicit or implicit change in the inflation target or shifts in long-term inflation expectations. And then temporary monetary policy shocks, which you might think as deviations from the average monetary policy rule over the sample period, noting that over our sample period, this would include the last 30 years of inflation. So we incorporate a period of what we traditionally think of as good policy making. So these will be shocks relative to that average policy regime, or the average policy response over the sample period. Pardon me. Now, and obviously aggregate demand shocks is where we would expect unanticipated fiscal shocks, and the go-stop policies that I mentioned earlier would appear. As I said, the other four shocks reflect financial market developments. So we have various shocks to capture competition, changes in competition in financial markets, access to wholesale funding and bank risk-taking, designed to pick up the developments in the financial sector, including the competition and credit control policy I mentioned. We also have risk premium shocks, which amongst other things will capture the financial market response to fiscal deficits. So that's the VAR that we try and do. Obviously, to identify the shocks, we have to use a set of theoretical restrictions, and what we use here are a set of traditional long run and timing restrictions to identify them, along with a cross-check on the signs of some of the responses that are left unrestricted, so informal sign restrictions, if you like. Now, given the time, I won't go into these in too much detail, but these impose things like long-run money neutrality and typical lags between policy changes, output, and inflation. So what I'm going to do here is build up the SVAR decomposition of movements in inflation into the contributions from different shocks. And the first shock I've shown you here is the contribution of the permanent monetary policy shock, which we interpret as driven by expectations of the implicit or explicit inflation target of the monetary policy authorities in a particular period. And this shows you that core inflation picked up to double digits in the late 1960s. But thereafter remained relatively stable until a small drop in 1976, and then a much bigger drop in the early 1980s. So it shows some signs of a similarity with the household inflation expectations I showed you earlier. And similarly, this measure does not appear to follow the peaks in inflation that I showed you earlier as well. So there's some similarity here between this derived measure from the SVAR and the household inflation expectations I showed you earlier. Now, if we layer on supply and other cost push shocks, these explain a fair chunk of the inflation burst we see in the mid-1970s and mid and late 1970s. Now, we need to note that these contributions embody the average monetary policy response to shocks over the sample period. So they show how much of the energy price shocks and other cost push shocks the average policymaker would have been expected to accommodate, including policymakers over the last 30 years in that average. So given the scale of the shocks that we showed earlier, particularly that 50% increase in import prices, we might have expected the policymaker at least to have accommodated some of those cost push pressures, given the trade-offs it induced. If we now layer on the impact of fiscal and other aggregate demand shocks in gold and some of the banking sector shocks, we can see that the direct impacts of these do add an extra bit of froth to inflation in this period, but noting again that they embody the average policy response of the sample period. And then finally, what I'm going to layer on are the contribution of temporary monetary policy shocks. So these measure, as I mentioned earlier, how much monetary policy deviated in particular periods from the what you might call the average policy reaction function. And these show very large positive contributions throughout the mid to late 1970s, these orange bars here. And this very much corresponds to the charts on real interest rates and Taylor rule comparisons that I showed you earlier. So monetary policy, at least on the face of this evidence, appears to either over-accommodate energy price shocks or not respond adequately to fiscal and other shocks, affecting the degree of degree of excess demand in the economy. So as I mentioned earlier, the SVAR's there mainly to give us a sort of broad overview of what may have gone wrong in the 1970s and highlight particular periods that we might want to focus on. And so what we do in the rest of the paper and the remaining few slides is home in on a few key periods of interest, and in particular on two particular questions that I raised at the start. Now, the SVAR itself suggests tighter monetary policy on its own might have reduced inflation in the mid-1970s had those orange bars been removed. But the question is, would it have been enough just to have had tighter monetary policy without a strong fiscal regime in place? The second question is what drove those movements in core inflation or inflation expectations, and how were those brought down in the late 70s and early 1980s, and could they have been reduced further? And our working hypothesis here is that the answer to both of these questions is fundamentally related to the fiscal regime. And so the next few slides, I'll drill down into the narrative and statistical evidence that we've had built so far to see the extent to which this holds. So turning to the first question, would tighter monetary policy have been on its own, enough on its own to lower inflation in the mid-1970s? Now, we know from sort of conventional new Keynesian theory on monetary policy that for monetary policy to have the correct sign on inflation requires that in expectation, there'll be some tightening of fiscal policy to meet higher debt service payments and stabilize the debt in the longer term. So essentially, that means committing the government to run higher future primary fiscal surpluses in response to a higher tightening of monetary policy. And in the words of Lieber, monetary policy needs to be active and fiscal policy passive for this to work as planned. Now, if fiscal policy does not behave in this passive way, monetary policy can, in these models, work in a perverse way, leading to what are called near-Fisherian or stepping on a rake effects, where inflation can actually increase rather than decrease in response to higher interest rates. And this is obviously articulated in the sort of modern fiscal theory of the price level, espoused by Chris Sims and John Cochrane and others. So the question is, how much does this apply to the mid-1970s? Would tightening of monetary policy in that mid-1970s period where we appear to have that over-accommodation of policy, what sort of regime does that look like? Well, in fact, we do have lots of evidence here that the fiscal regime in this particular period does appear relatively passive. So if we first look at some narrative evidence, the first piece of evidence is simply comes from the memoirs of Douglas Wass, who was the head civil servant at the UK Treasury at the time. And writing retrospectively, he writes of this period, whether the budget was in balance or had a surplus or deficit was a secondary consideration. Indeed, for some policymakers, it was of virtually no importance. And so this suggests that little thought was given to what the level of deficit should have been at any particular point, and sort of adds some weight to this idea that fiscal policy was not passive. Now, this is backed up by some more narrative evidence on fiscal policy, and this is work I mentioned earlier by James Cloyne. And what James shows in his work is that in the post-World War II period, there were virtually no identified taxation increases associated with closing the deficit, until a consolidation starts in 1976. So there does appear to be some narrative evidence here that the fiscal policy regime was not passive in the way that modern monetary policy would want it to be. And now we also know from this period that the fiscal rule exhibited substantial nominal instability. I mentioned earlier, public sector pay increases went straight into public sector borrowing. And this was augmented by other fiscal measures that were introduced by the government, similar to many happening today, which were trying to mitigate the cost pressures on households from higher input prices and wages. Amongst other things, this involves subsidizing food, rent and mortgages to try and put a lid on wage demands in the mid-1970s. And indeed, tax cuts were introduced in some budgets to try and persuade the unions not to raise wage demands. Now, the result of this fiscal policy response was that public spending was increasingly perceived to be out of control. And this was most overtly espoused by Wim Godley, an economist at the Treasury and later at Cambridge. And he argued that half of the rise in public expenditure between the early and mid-1970s could not be accounted for by announced policy changes. Now, part of the problem here was that government spending plans were set in volume terms many years ahead. And so nominal government spending in cash terms would simply accommodate burgeoning public sector wage increases and other costs. And because I showed you earlier, these costs rose by more than those in the private sector, there was then this so-called relative price effect that meant government spending as a share of GDP as a ratio of tax income would tend to rise. Now, there was the hope that North Sea oil revenues, the discovery of North Sea oil, would come on stream in the mid-1980s that would allow some of these large deficits to be repaid. And this is part of the tunneling through idea that we sort of develop in the paper, but even these increasingly looked insufficient to plug the gap. Now, on top of this sort of narrative evidence, we have tried to do some econometric work on this, and we did a focused local projections exercise on a subsample of 1965 to 1982, where we looked at the impact of commodity price shocks in the mid-1970s and how they affected public sector debt, and in particular the primary fiscal surplus. And indeed, it sort of backs up this idea that in response to commodity price shocks, the primary fiscal surplus fell rather than increased, which is counter to how it should behave in a sort of active monetary passive fiscal regime. So we do have some econometric evidence that we've started looking into that seems to sort of back up this narrative. Now, of course, financial markets at the time did not have modern day theories of the fiscal theory, but as I mentioned in the introduction, it was clear that financial markets had some form of fiscal theory in their heads. But what was that theory, and how does it differ from the sort of more modern fiscal theories of inflation that we see today? Well, increasingly popular in both financial markets and policy-making circles at the time was the sort of credit counterparts approach, which linked government borrowing from the banking system to the broad money supply. And this theory suggested that there was a limit on the flow of borrowing that the government could obtain from traditional non-bank investors such as pension funds, and so unexpectedly large fiscal deficits had to be residually financed by selling shorter-term debt to the banking system, and this had the effect of creating bank deposits and boosting the broad money supply. So it was this fiscal link with broad money supply, which many at the time thought would had an inflationary consequence and would cause inflation to rise. So this theory has some sort of echoes of the Sargent and Wallace unpleasant monetarist arithmetic theory, which I mentioned at the beginning, but the emphasis in the credit counterparts was on the flow of borrowing constraint rather than a sort of debt limit on the stock. And there's an emphasis on broad money rather than narrow money creation. And this underfunding of the government deficit, as it was called, many are viewed as analogous with government bond purchases under quantitative easing that we've seen recently. And this is because borrowing from the banking system, whether from the central bank or commercial bank, tends to create bank deposits and broad money. So there is some analogy people make with QE here. Now, if we go back, if we look at the size of this financing, the deficit via the banking system in terms of its contribution to broad money growth, and this is shown in red here, you can see the size of this contribution was quite marked during the 1970s. And so the boost to broad money growth that I showed you earlier in the early 1970s wasn't just a function of private sector credit creation and the response of financial policies designed to liberate the banking system. And as you can see, these contributions to broad money growth are similar in scale to those that we've seen in QE, the recent QE periods. Now, financial markets and other commentators were increasingly viewing large government deficits through this lens as an important driver of broad money growth. And because of the difficulty of financing large deficits from non-banks, it was in this sense that financial markets became worried. And this is part of the reason why in 1976 there was a gilt strike that I mentioned earlier, which was a clear manifestation of that. So in this sense, reducing the budget deficit had to be part of any plan to reduce inflation, simply because of the weight financial markets and bodies like the IMF placed on it as a source of inflationary pressure. It would act as a coordinating device, if you like, to anchor expectations. And the theory the theory underlying the exact theory underlying the link between deficits and inflation was sort of second order in that sort of more practical sense. Now, just to end the presentation, we now turn to the second question, and basically showing that there is a set of narrative and statistical evidence that fiscal policy may have had an important role in reducing inflation expectations after this period, in breaking this link between money growth and inflation, and some of the developments that I showed you. Now, the evidence. The evidence I showed earlier suggested there was some dip in inflation expectations in the late 1970s and again in the early 1980s. And this ties in well with two well-known fiscal consolidation episodes in those periods. The first was in 1976, which was a famous speech by the UK Prime Minister, James Callaghan, which essentially rejected the post-war Keynesian consensus that fiscal policy should be used for demand management. And after this speech, monetary targets were formally introduced and cash limits were introduced on public spending that limited the feedback loop of higher public sector pay into government spending and the primary deficit that I mentioned earlier. The second major fiscal event occurred in 1981 when the Chancellor Geoffrey Howe tightened fiscal policy in the teeth of the recession. The Thatcher government had entered office in 1979 with a program called the Medium-Term Financial Strategy, which was a program of monetary gradualism based on a set of declining targets for broad money growth. But due to the rapid introduction of financial liberalization measures, these monetary targets were missed, prompting higher interest rates and a deep recession, which then forced the government into a large deficit. And in order to bring the MTFS back on track, Geoffrey Howe tightened fiscal policy substantially in 1981, and Howe resorted to actually overfunding the deficit by selling more gilts to the non-bank investors than required to fund the deficit, which had the effect of reducing broad money growth rather than adding to it. He also introduced index-linked gilts, which would also reduce the incentives of the government to inflate away the nominal debt. Now, both of these, just to finish off, both of these fiscal events appear to time well with falls in household inflation expectations that I showed you earlier, and indeed the core inflation estimate from the SFAR. And both of these estimates, when we try and correlate them with these fiscal events, suggest a role for fiscal policy and changes in the fiscal policy regime in ending the great inflation in the UK. Now, what we've done so far to try and test this are some simple statistical tests, whether inflation expectations behave more like a set of regime shifts, and how coincident those are with the identified shifts in the fiscal monetary policy regime, rather than as a more reactionary or adaptive process to inflation outturns. And we use some simple regime switching and structural break tests, such as Byper-On tests, to show that there is evidence that inflation expectations can be described as a stationary series around a set of regime shifts, and coincident with some of the changes in the monetary fiscal regime I mentioned a moment ago. Now, these tests are very simple, and this is something we're still working on, and we're very much in the market for suggestions for how we might do this in a more convincing way. So I think my time is up. That's where we've got to in terms of our results. There's a list of conclusions so far, which I won't go through in great detail given the time, but just to sum up, we do feel there is evidence for our conjecture that shifts in the fiscal regime were a crucial part in ending the great inflation in the UK, in line with Sargent's view about the ending of moderate inflations. And in general, it's fair to say, I think, that fiscal policy became the focus of both the authorities and financial markets in getting inflation down in the late 1970s and 1980s. And in that sense, operate as a sort of coordinating or disciplining device for achieving that. And so I'll leave you there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions and suggestions. So I'll hand back to Nathan, who I think's been collecting some of these. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Ryland, for a fascinating presentation. I'd like to remind the audience to put your questions in the Q&A, use the Q&A button, and type your questions in, and I'll read them through to Ryland. So in the meantime, while the audience is typing their questions, let me begin by asking you a couple of things that I've related to your presentation. So recently, I mean, for different purposes, I looked at this episode, trying to show some comparisons with the modern day, the current contemporary inflation experience, especially trying to see what how strong is this cost push stagflation type of arguments versus the more sort of fiscal monetary looseness or demand side stories. So I didn't go into any of this very detailed econometric analysis or even qualitative analysis that you presented right now. But I looked at one thing that struck me, and I don't know if you looked at it as well. That's from my experience as a central banker. I like to always look at these beverage curves, and to look at the tightness of the labor market in some sense as an indicator, because there's a lot of narrative now that the current period is different from the one in the 70s, because in the 70s trade unions were strong and now they're weak, and so we cannot really compare the two periods. But what you've shown obviously is that it's not clear that the trade unions are the culprits behind, and there was no real very strong wage inflation spiral that you evidenced. But when you look at these beverage curves, you can definitely see that there's a run up from the early 70s up to the first oil shock, where the labor market tightened very significantly. So I don't know how's that showing up in your narrow estimates, but the simple beverage curve would indicate that the UK economy was running very hot when the supply shocks hit, and the monetary policy or fiscal policy was not used to cool down this thing. And then you have this obviously unforeseen event of the oil shock, the first. And the same thing, if you do the same, repeat the same exercise for the 79, 78 episode, that's your other peak in inflation, you see the same thing. After the first oil shock, and there's some kind of a little recession, and then the labor market tightens up again. So just before the second oil shock hits. And so how did you look at these things, and how would they fit with your narrative on the contribution of sort of the real side of the economy to this inflationary episode?
Yes, thank you, Nathan. Yeah, no, that's a good question. That is something we looked at. I'm just trying to. We do have a chart on the Beveridge curve in our paper to sort of go along to sort of corroborate the Nehru story, and it sort of does show this sort of shift out that you mentioned, both in the mid 1970s and the late 1970s. So I think it does corroborate that Nehru story. I could share my screen and show, but you can see it in the paper. It's sort of very much as you described. We see that shifting out of the Beveridge curve. So we sort of use that in the paper to sort of back up the sort of Kalman filter estimate of the Nehru. So I think that's generally a hypothesis here that there is evidence, I think, of this idea that Orphanides and others have said that the policymakers were generally over optimistic about the supply side of the economy. I mean, I obviously talked about dashes for growth and trying to achieve growth, but more generally, I think, obviously, theories of the natural rate were only just developing over this period. Unemployment had been very low in the 1950s and 60s, and so they were keen to do that. And indeed, many of the responses in the period were trying to stop inflation getting above 1 million, which today wouldn't be seen as that low an unemployment rate. So there was this emphasis on unemployment and this sort of developing. There was a developing understanding that something was wrong on the supply side, but obviously sort of not this sort of they didn't have the tools to really evaluate how big that sort of rise in the natural rate would be. And obviously, this is some of the work that I mentioned earlier, Nelson and Nikolov did. They sort of demonstrated this idea that the policymaker was acting flying blind slightly and couldn't quite foresee these developments on the supply side. And indeed, obviously, productivity growth is part of that as well. 1973 is always seen as the ending of the ending of the sort of golden period of productivity growth, and policymakers only gradually became aware of that over time. So I think there is certainly true that is that over optimism on the supply side does contribute to policy mistakes, understandable policy mistakes over this period. But obviously, declining supply side performance obviously had ramifications of public sector borrowing, and to the extent that there's a link between public sector borrowing and either money growth and inflation expectations, obviously there's a feedback loop there. Ollie, I don't know if there's anything you've got to add on that.
Nothing for me.
Okay, thank you. So we have one question for the audience right now from Robert Farago, and asking you whether the period from 1919 to 1920 could be another relevant comparison, because there was the post-war inflation episode, and unemployment was low, we had strikes, etc. Did you extend or try to extend your narrative backwards, or you're thinking about doing it?
No, it's a very good question, actually. I mean, obviously, at the bank, we've been interested in lots of earlier periods of inflation. I do think there is some. There's actually a famous paper that says 1919 is in need of more attention. It's literally got that title. And obviously, what we have there is, end of the war. You have this sort of private sector boom period. Obviously, there's demobilization going on. Very similar to the pandemic, dislocation of demand, and then obviously policy tightens in response to that. But obviously, fiscal deficits are very high, and then you get this sort of massive slump. You have industrial relations problems. You also have a fall in the labour supply in 1919, 1920, not in the form of labour participation, which is a big issue in the UK, but a fall in average hours. There was a move to sort of 48-hour week there. So there are lots of interesting analogies there that would be interesting to pursue. And obviously, thinking about fiscal policy in this period, obviously, I showed you earlier the sort of fiscal orthodoxy in that, obviously in the interwar period, the government's trying to run these primary surpluses, so it is following that orthodoxy. And obviously there were fiscal policy contraction in the early 1920s, trying to keep obviously with the debt so high, interest payments so high, there's this a massive focus on fiscal policy here, which is different, obviously, to the 1970s there. So in that sense, the period is quite different, and the response to that is quite different. But of course, people would point to the 1920s, given the sort of poor outcomes on the real side, high unemployment, high structural unemployment in the 1920s in the UK, and obviously that carries over into the Great Depression. As some people have pointed out in our paper, if you look at the real outcomes of the 1970s, they don't appear that bad. Obviously, the authorities are trying to sort of, as we talked about earlier, trying to get low unemployment, trying to achieve faster growth. So there is a sort of general comparison here between the two periods. What is the optimal policy between those periods? Was there too much tightening of monetary and fiscal policy in the 1920s? Obviously, I forgot to mention the return to gold and the fixed exchange rate regime that was also going on there. So comparing those two periods, the interwar period and the 1970s is indeed something that could usefully be done. We obviously haven't done it yet. Our paper is 100 pages already, but that's certainly something we're interested in and something I plan to have a look at more closely. Korean War is also another interesting period I didn't talk about in the early 1950s, where obviously you have commodity prices and other prices are quite strong. You have a war, you have a large pickup in inflation, and in that period, obviously, the debt to income ratios are still quite high after the war. So again, that's another interesting comparison, I think.
Well, thank you. Let me ask you another question, which is related to the end of Bretton Woods and the floating exchange rates. And in your expectations figure, one of the almost last ones maybe the last one you showed in your presentation, this is kind of a regime change of expected inflation. And to what extent, I mean, in terms of your econometrics and thinking, this depreciation, devaluation, which also feeds into import prices you've shown in one of your first slides, how much that is endogenous to expectations about the fiscal regime, about the monetary regime. So, because obviously this is something endogenous in the system, and I guess in the VRs you probably dealt with this, but to what extent this mechanism of the devaluation is operating? We've seen that now in the recent episode, the recent after the elections and the proposed budget that was canceled, the effect of exchange rates and depreciation of the sterling again, quite recently. So, how is that part of your story, and whether again, is there something the policy could have done to stabilize expectations about the exchange rate or anything of that sort? Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, this is something we touched on this a bit more in the paper, Nathan. Obviously, the behaviour of sterling over this period is very important and how endogenous it is. I mean, the interesting thing I think is we see this pickup in inflation expectations after the '67 devaluation, and we see this sort of wage explosions happening in the early 1970s. So this is a little bit unexplained, really, I think, as part of our story. We don't really have a good story for that, other than the fact that, we had this devaluation and there might have been some anticipation that Bretton Woods was on its last legs, and that might have had some effect on wage and price inflation. I think after Bretton Woods collapses, there's obviously an issue in the UK of, oh no, what's our nominal anchor? So this is part of our muddling through hypothesis, and clearly that was difficult for the authorities to manage. Most of the 1970s, even though monetary targeting does come in the late 70s, there is a sort of quasi-managed exchange rate regime here where the authorities are trying to work out, or trying to manage sterling over this period. So it's not just a case of interest rates and fiscal policy. Exchange rate policy and intervention is important here, and we touch on that a bit in the paper. Obviously, others have written, Catherine Schenk and others, Alan Neff have written on this a bit more recently than more depth. What I would say is that obviously the difficulty the UK has in this period, particularly as a net oil importer, is that the balance of payments deficit or the current account deficit goes into, it's a twin deficit problem with the fiscal deficit. And obviously, authorities seem to know seem to think, at least in the mid-70s, they actually want a real depreciation. They actually need a real depreciation of sterling. to actually get the current account under control. But how do you manage that? How much is done through a normal depreciation? How much do you do through trying to force wages and prices down? So there's clearly a sort of optimal policy problem they have here, given those high import prices, given the depreciation of sterling. But certainly, I think the exchange rate, I mean, we need to do a bit more work on this. Obviously, I mentioned the link with the gilt markets and the gilt strike and the relations with the fiscal deficit. We ought to do a bit more, I think, on trying to tie exchange rate expectations or expectations in foreign exchange markets more to the fiscal deficit issue. Obviously, there's been a lot of work done on the 1976 issue, which is when the IMF get called in, and there's a lot of work being done on that. And clearly, the discussions in the with the IMF in that period were all about. Obviously, the IMF were actually a big proponent of the credit counterparts, and obviously a lot of the focus there was on reducing public spending. That was the way of ending the crisis. That was a way of garnering support for the IMF to support sterling. And so obviously there was a clear link there. And obviously once the IMF, I mean, I think it's fair to say the government had already embarked on the task of fiscal consolidation before the IMF came along, but then the IMF sort of gave them the sort of strength to sort of face off people on the, particularly in the Labour government, who were arguing for a siege economy and not acceding to the tight fiscal policy that the IMF wanted. So I think that's right, Nathan, that we probably need to do a bit more work to articulate that link, the endogenous response of the exchange rate to these expectations. We've done these very crude links between. I think the plan is to try and do something. Try and test the sort of joint code breaking across series when you have. Ollie, sorry, did you want to come in there?
So partly you were just breaking up a bit, right? But yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely echo the change in sentiment around 76 and the commitment. So the IMF program was completely framed in terms of fiscal tightening, and the change in sentiment in foreign exchange markets then was just, if you look at I'm not sure, I can't remember if we've got it in the paper, but the plot of our FX reserves in 1977. I mean, it's really astonishing just how quickly we built up our FX reserves, because we didn't want the exchange rate to appreciate as quickly as markets thought it should. I mean, on the kind of, should we look at this in our VAR setup? Yeah, I think that's we should do that, and kind of we're working on a little toy model to think through our the impulse response functions we already presented to you, that are just on the domestic economy, but we should do the equivalent for the open economy as well. So we've got a kind of better story of how this fits with what was going on with sterling in the current account.
Okay, so we're almost about the time to end our formal part of the discussion. I mean, just in terms of the exchange rate, you can try and plug in a UIP equation within the model just to see, so that's, they use it in the DSG models, but it's something you can also use in your analysis. It could maybe give some insights about what's going on in the exchange rate, but it's just a suggestion. But anyway, so we're up at the official ending time, 6 o'clock in Geneva, 5 o'clock in the UK. And first of all, I'd like to thank Ryland and Ollie for this fascinating presentation, and also like to thank our audience for attending the seminar. And this is, as I said when I introduced this is the end of the fall series of our seminar, and we look forward to seeing you again in the spring with a new lineup of online seminars. And now we can move on to the informal part. If people have any questions they want to raise, Rui, if you wanted to add something, so we can discuss these things informally. Yeah, there's Rui.
Yeah, here I am. I've been here all the time. So, you know, I've been thinking that I understand what you're trying to do, right? So you're trying to parse these two interpretations of the rising inflation, and you do all these compositions, and that's all fine. But in a sense, all of these could have been endogenous, right? So you focus a lot on inflation expectations, but how about the market expectations about the public sector's borrowing needs, right? Is there a way of separating both? And of course, you know, what motivates this question is Gauti Egerton's paper on Great Expectations, Ending the Great Depression, right? Where he explicitly models these two things separately, right? In the context of the ESG model with repeated interaction between the government and the markets, right? Do you think that you could do something similar in this case? Because if indeed, I mean, the paper is essentially converging towards the fiscal theory, but it would be interesting to see if there would be a way of directly testing for this, rather than, you know, the backdoor channel through you know, borrowing from the banking sector.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we've been looking at. I mean, Ollie, you've been having this is something you've been thinking about, haven't you? Financial market expectations and sort of more high frequency analysis of how they responded to fiscal policy and other announcements. I think, I mean, as you say, Rui, we've sort of exploited this available data on household inflation expectations, and, you know, obviously these are derived from surveys and things like this. And so, whereas as we discussed, the sort of pinch point for the government policy was financial market expectations and how they're affecting asset prices. And this is what's really causing the problems for the government at the time. So I think we do need to do something, certainly something more on that. As you said, we've sort of got an empirical, we've largely used an empirical framework here. We have been sort of building a more DSG model, which I'd used for some earlier work on oil prices for the recent period, but it's something I'm thinking about trying to apply here. I think doing some experiments of that nature, where you have different expectations between different participants, and obviously there are ways of, there are obviously ways of doing that in a DSG model where you sort of, you know, you take out the rational expectation and you put in an expectations process for different agents in the model, and then you sort of see how the reactions differ. So I think that's something we've sort of got on the agenda a little bit, but Ollie's been thinking a bit more about the empirical side of that as well. I don't know, Ollie, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah. So you're right, Rui, that we need to do more on this. I mean, I guess the two things kind of for me kind of stand out in the existing paper and point towards a kind of fiscal story. Number one, the narrative evidence on the fiscal reaction function, and that's really the key thing in these models, which determine whether you have fiscal dominance or monetary dominance or indeterminacy. And I guess the second thing is, which in particular needs more work to bring it closer to theory, is the response to shock. So what kind of on the to-do list is integrate work using toy models with monetary and fiscal dominance, and show how the response to shocks, and in our period, like the key shocks of interest are going to be, as Rai said, supply side shocks, commodity shocks, but possibly labour market shocks, productivity shocks too, and show how the response of the economy, inflation, exchange rates, to Nathan's point, and indeed financial market expectations, to your point, varies depending on which regime you're in, and show, you know, which regime appears to be favoured by the data. And we, you know, on financial market expectations, I guess we've done a lot of collection of gilt market prices, so we can use those data to integrate in that exercise. So I guess that's the kind of the broad approach we're taking. I guess elsewhere in the literature, in the US literature on the 1970s, I guess there's more a kind of, well, what we're going to do is just estimate DSG models, and then allow the data to choose between fiscal dominance, monetary dominance, and determinacy. So there's the Lubick Shorefeider paper, and regime switching stuff by Bianchi and so on.
Mm-hmm.
We could go down that track too. I guess we thought that the key thing value we're bringing in that these authors don't is the economic history, and so perhaps perhaps we don't need to go kind of fully towards estimating full DSG models and letting them decide between the parameters and the policy rules, and take a kind of somewhat simpler approach on the empirical side.
Yeah, and I wasn't suggesting that either, right? It's really not trivial, but I still wanted to raise the issue, right? However you're going to deal with it, right? I'm agnostic, but yeah.
If jumping in here, I mean, one thing I never thought, I mean, your paper really highlighted something that I didn't really look at in the past, is the use of, so the difference between broad money and narrow money in terms of financing the government. So it's the banks are buying or the central bank is buying. And so you obviously show that the contribution of this sort of inside money expansion on inflation, but I mean, it's always given the alternative. So had it not gone through the banks directly, but through central bank purchases of government bonds, for instance, would the outcome be any different? Or that's something interesting to look at, especially in the context of what's happening now in Europe, where a lot of because of the structure of obviously the ECB and the sovereignty issue of the different states, is that European banks are financing government deficits basically in the different Euro zone countries, and then again, how's that? And I think it's a nice angle. I don't think just recently had a seminar, a talk by the chairman of the European Banking Authority, and so he talked a lot about this problem of European banks buying sovereign debt of their own countries as kind of a problem. But he looked at it from more of the macroprudential angle, but it seems like there's also an inflationary angle and a domestic inflationary angle. Let's put it this way. So the ECB could be doing one thing, but anyway, this is a nice angle that I haven't thought about, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about it in the 2 or 3 minutes we have remaining.
Yeah, no, actually, Nathan, it's a project. It's a new project I'm starting. It's going to look at that over and under funding that I showed you. So basically, I'm trying to draw this analogy between quantitative easing purchases by the central bank versus purchases of debt by commercial banks. So those red bars I showed you in the chart on broad money growth. We have a project on to try and use that to try and identify what you might call our quasi QE shocks over the past, and then do some time variation regime switching analysis to see are they different? Are they different things? And so this is partly motivated by quantitative tightening that we've started, because there is this period I mentioned over funding in the mid-1980s, which appears very much like quantitative tightening, where the government is selling more gilts than it actually needs to fund the deficit. But also more generally, this underfunding, where you are actually financing a lot of the deficit from the banking system and creating broad money. That is a natural analog to QE if you look at it from these broad money terms. And so, is it that from a portfolio balancing perspective, it might be the same, because it's essentially it's banks rather than pension funds taking up gilts, and obviously if there's preferred habitats and things like this, then that should have a similar portfolio balancing effect, you might argue. But obviously the reasons for doing it and the financial stability implications are obviously different, whether the central bank's buying the gilts or maybe indemnified as in QE, or whether you're leaving commercial banks exposed to gilt prices and things like that. So that is a sort of separate project I'm about to start with some other colleagues. So it'll trigger the same thought, Nathan.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting angle. I think that's overlooked in this, even in the contemporary policy debates about. It's looked through a very narrow lens, and you're sort of proposing to look at through a broader lens of. I mean, it just has occurred to me as a very nice thing. And if it's another, definitely, I think your paper is already long enough, but that it's going to be a spin-off, a very fruitful spin-off, which again would be very timely with policy implications. Yeah.
Yeah, so hopefully we're going to start that work next year, early next year. But I've got to finish this paper first, haven't I?
Yeah, first things first.
First things first, yeah.
Okay, so great for bringing the paper to us. It's been great to have you. Come back in the new year. And I think, Nathan, you're chairing, so you should have the last word. So.
Well, I mean, we both chaired the series. So, but again, thank you, Ryland and Ollie, for joining, and thank you for the audience who is still around for your participation. And we look forward to seeing all of you in the new year.
All right. So happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays. Happy
Thank
New
you very
Year.
much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Bye-bye.